The 1960s brought us the muscle car, and virtually every other class of car as well. When the decade started, most full-size American cars still had fins. In fact, fins would remain popular until about 1962, when most mainstream brands would start to phase them out, although luxury brands would keep them around much longer. And the trend of fins in the early 60s was more of a gull wing look, something that could be seen on like the Impala and the Galaxy. Cadillac, however, was still the dominant source of fins. In fact, in 1961 and 1962, they had both upper and lower fins, or a fin and a skeg if you prefer. And who's to argue with Cadillac at this point, because they had become totally dominant in the luxury car field. Not only were they outselling every other luxury brand combined, but the closest competitor to new Cadillac sales was used Cadillac sales. Meanwhile, other brands were not only struggling, but restructuring. The Willys name would be dropped after 1963, and from that point forward, all Jeeps would be built by, well, Jeep. The Rambler name would be phased out at AMC to be replaced by AMC, which created some naming structure issues. For example, the Rambler American became the American Rambler. Studebaker was also struggling. The Studebaker LARK was restyled to look more like the Mercedes it was sold alongside, but that didn't really help its sales any. The Hawk, now known as the Hawk Gran Turismo or Hawk GT, was replaced by the cutting-edge AVANTI. But even though the AVANTI set numerous land speed records, it didn't help Studebaker continue in production. After 1964, they withdrew to Canada, hoping that they could continue on as a limited production brand, but ultimately only survived a couple more years. The AVANTI itself, however, continued on past Studebaker and was produced through the end of the century using GM running gear. The DeSoto division of Chrysler was also phased out, being effectively replaced by the Custom Series Dodges for just a couple of years before they went away, partly because brands were offering more and more models to fill up different market segments. One of these segments was the compact segment. Now, NASH had been offering the compact Rambler since 1950, and when it became the Rambler brand, the NASH Rambler became the Rambler American, and that continued on through the 60s, again becoming the AMC Rambler. Studebaker replaced their standards in 1959 with the much smaller LARK, but wasn't marketed as a compact and had a V8 option from the beginning. It mostly competed in the compact segment. But all of the big three entered the compact segment in 1960. Ford was the most successful with the Falcon, which stylistically and mechanically was exactly what you would expect from a smaller Ford. Chrysler kind of went off track with the Valiant. It was originally created as a separate division and sold through Chrysler Plymouth dealerships. It was smaller than most of the American compacts of the period, but also handled better, got better mileage, and was more reliable. But it had Chrysler-inspired styling that was kind of awkward looking on a small car, and combining that with the confusion of what it was didn't really help. In 1961, it was officially made a Plymouth, and Dodge got its own version called the Lancer. But when the styling was updated in 1963, the Dodge moved slightly up market and got a new name, Dart. GM did things a little differently. Instead of making what appeared to be another GM car, they were more inspired by a popular import of the period, the Volkswagen Beetle. So what GM got was a flat six stuffed in the rear of the new Corvair. And although the Corvair continued through the end of the decade, Chevy moved to a more conservative replacement in 1962 with the Chevy 2 Nova. Another new segment that appeared in the early 60s were super stocks. superstocks were effectively thinly veiled factory race cars. And one of the first attempts of this was the 409 Supersport, a base full-size Chevrolet with a big high-performance V8. Pontiac soon followed suit with the Grand Prix, a slightly smaller, lighter version of the big Pontiac that was available with the big 421 Super Duty. Soon Chrysler took things a step further with their own superstocks, the Dodge RAMCHARGER and the Plymouth Superstock. And then Ford moved things down to the mid-size market by dropping an FE 427 with cold air induction into the mid-sized Ford Fairlane and calling it the Thunderbolt. By the end of the decade, Chrysler had taken it to the compact market by dropping the 440 and the 426 Hemi into the A-body Dodge Dart and Plymouth Barracuda and dubbed them the A-Bombs. As mentioned, there was also a mid-size segment. Arguably, AMC was the first into the segment when they downsized to Rambler in the late 50s, but the standard Ramblers of the early 60s were marketed as standards, and people who bought these cars could be offended if you referred to them as anything less. You also had the upmarket compacts. As was typical, when Ford introduced the Falcon, Mercury got a version that was slightly bigger and slightly more powerful called the Comet. And in 1961, GM offered the F-body upmarket compacts, the Pontiac Tempest Le Mans, the Oldsmobile F85 Cutlass, and the Buick Special SKYLARK. And these were upmarket compacts. These were the cars that introduced the legendary Buick V6. The Oldsmobile would introduce America to the turbocharger. And the Pontiac was available with independent rear suspension and a positronic limited slip rear differential, better known as Posi or Posi-Track. But Ford would be the first to offer an actual mid-size car. They wanted a car that would fit between the large Galaxy and the small Falcon, and in 1962 introduced the Fairlane to fit between them. And of course, Mercury followed suit with a car that was slightly bigger and slightly more powerful, although significantly less successful, with the Mercury Meteor. GM's upmarket compacts got bigger in 63 and bigger again in 64 and effectively entered the mid-size market that year and were joined by a Chevrolet version called the CHEVELLE Malibu. Chrysler entered the segment from an opposite direction. In 1962, they introduced smaller standards. Those standards were considered too small for the growing large car market at the time and were replaced by bigger cars in 1965. And the existing standards became the new mid-size models. Dodge revived the Coronet for 1965 to compete in this segment, and while Plymouth continued on as the Belvedere, the upmarket version Fury went to the newer, bigger car, and the upmarket version of the Belvedere that continued on took on the Satellite name. The personal luxury cars from the 1950s had kind of lost favor with one exception, the Ford Thunderbird, which in the early 60s dominated the segment. Its only real competition were still dressed up standards, things like the Chrysler 300, the Pontiac Grand Prix, the Buick Wildcat. The first car that came out that was aimed to compete directly with it would be the Buick Riviera of 1963, a car that would be the styling inspiration over the next several years. So, naturally, the Ford had to be restyled to stay competitive. Soon, the Riviera was joined at GM by the Toronado, and it was pretty well established that this class would be the styling leader for the foreseeable future. And not only was the Toronado a styling leap forward, but it was also a technical leap forward, introducing front-wheel drive. But it was the first large production front-wheel drive American car. And although one might question its success, it was a big enough deal that Cadillac got its own version in 1967, called the Eldorado. And naturally, since Cadillac had entered the class, Lincoln had to follow suit with the all-new Lincoln Mark III. And no surprise to anyone, smaller cars started to get sporty versions. Typically, this was something like a 4-speed manual and bucket seats, slapped into a typical 6-cylinder coupe with a GT badge slapped on it, like in a Falcon or a Dart. But soon V8s started to be dropped into these small cars, like the Falcon Sprint and the Super Sport Nova. And Studebaker had already been offering a V8 in their small LARK, so naturally they added an optional supercharger in the R2 package. The Corvair, which it wasn't feasible to drop a V8 into, got a turbocharged version of its Flat 6, which would later earn it the name the poor man's Porsche, even though it had a turbo Flat 6 a decade before Porsche did. Soon Plymouth was taking things a step further by offering a slightly altered styling version of the Valiant that included a fastback and had the Barracuda name slapped on it. But what really impacted the market was when Ford completely restyled the Falcon with an all-new sportier version called the Mustang. This car would be the most successful introductory model of all time, which is why this whole class of American sporty coupes, or American GTs if you will, would become known as pony cars. In 1967, the Mustang took a mild restyling that enabled them to drop bigger engines in it, and there was an upmarket version by Mercury, as expected, called the Cougar. The Plymouth Barracuda was also restyled that way for the same reason, but also to help differentiate it from the cheaper Valiant cars. And GM entered the segment with the Chevrolet Camaro and the Pontiac Firebird. The following year, even AMC got into the act with the Javelin. Now, we can't talk about pony cars without talking about muscle cars, which takes us to the Pontiac GTO, which was essentially a way for GM to offer a high-performance car that was not technically a factory race car, but it followed a similar kind of formula. Essentially, John DeLorean took the mid-size Pontiac Tempest Le Mans, dropped a big 389 tri-power from the full-size Pontiac in it, threw on a hood scoop with 4-speed transmission and a Ferrari name, and the muscle car was born as we know it. Naturally, this spread across the other GM divisions, and we soon ended up with the Buick Skylark GS400, the Oldsmobile Cutlass 442, or 4-barrel 4-speed dual exhaust, and the Chevy Chevelle Super Sport 396. Then the other American manufacturers started offering their own versions, like the Dodge Coronet RT 440 or RT Hemi, and the Plymouth GTX, and later a budget version of the GTX that would be known as the Roadrunner. And although Ford already had the Thunderbolt, they would start offering more streetable big engine versions of their mid-size cars, like the Fairlane GT and XL or Extra Lively, as well as the Mercury Cyclones and Cyclone Spoiler. And another thing that came out of this was attempts at aerodynamics. Now, for the most part, this simply meant fastback body styles, which was not just limited to the Barracuda and Mustang, or even to pony cars. AMC slapped a fastback on its standard and called it the Marlin. A special aero version of the Coronet was introduced in 1966, introducing us to the Charger. And Ford not only gave us fastback versions of its mid-size Fairlane, Torino, and Mercury Montego, but also fastback versions of the full-size cars, like the LTD. But the fastback wasn't the only attempt at an aero trend. The flush-mounted grille was also something that they were trying to improve aerodynamics. So not only was the first Charger an attempt at an aero front end on an existing car, but even after they gave up the aero look of the Charger in '68 for a more muscular look that would hopefully sell better, they still offered an aero package on it known as the 500, which included a flush-mounted grille and a flush-mounted back window, instead of the concave window on other Chargers. And Ford did something similar to try to take advantage of this in NASCAR on their mid-size car, such as on the Torino Talladega. And of course, Chrysler took it even a step further with the Charger Daytona and Superbird Roadrunner with the 18-inch plastic cone on the front that gave it a rocket shape and the 2.5-foot wing on the back that was solidly mounted to the fenders but had to be high enough that the trunk lid would clear it. But performance wasn't the only advancement that was made in the 60s. Part of this was due to Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, where he used the Chevrolet Corvair as an example as to why cars were essentially rolling death traps. The result of this was, of course, more safety concerns and things like seat belts, and backup lights, which had been options on cars for years, became mandatory standard features. There was also a move towards cleaner burning engines that no longer required leaded fuel. And another major trend of the period was interdivisional sharing. Traditionally, when you moved up market within the same company from one division to another, you got a bigger car with a different drivetrain. And although platforms were often shared across divisions, they were extended as you moved up market. And that's something that started to change. For example, at the beginning of the 1960s, you would expect a Mercury version of a Ford to be bigger than the Ford version. But by the end of the 60s, that was no longer necessarily the case. Long before the end of the 60s, both Ford and Chrysler were sharing drivetrains across divisions. And although GM was starting to do this, they would not implement it fully until the 1980s. There's one more class that came about in the 1960s that I want to mention. Touring coupes. Touring coupes were little more than the personal luxury coupe concept bleeding down into the mid-size market. These were specialty mid-size coupes, sort of a predecessor to the two-door sports sedan. And some of these earlier cars could be considered the AMC Marlin and the Dodge Charger. But the car that really brought this segment to life was the all-new downsized Pontiac Grand Prix of 1969. Although mechanically, it was essentially the same thing as the Tempest Le Mans they've been offering for the last couple of years. But it offered more features and more style. And the following year, Chevrolet would get its own version of this car called the Monte Carlo, and this segment would explode to dominate the 1970s, which we will come back to in our next video.